Coming up.
For 6 years before the RCMP thwarted a terrorist plot that would have killed people in the GTA, somewhere in Toronto, presumably, after 6 security checks. You can appreciate why Canadians are concerned, can't you?
Obviously, someone who is in an office who's interviewing this individual had concerns. They identified a risk. That same risk appeared again months later. It again appeared again years later. Yet this person was able to get temporary status, permanent status, and then become a Canadian citizen, all while these risks were being presented. How?
Now, Ms. Danmoff talks about how difficult it is to access the dark web. Well, you know what? Canadians aren't expecting Ms. Danmoff to protect us. We're expecting CSIS, law enforcement, and the government who has access to the dark web. And this should have been on your radar map, and you failed us.
Mr. McQuarrie, when you started out, you said, I'm not sure that there are any failures. And you talked about the robust process. With all due respect, I'm not sure that that satisfies the average Canadian.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
So I'd like now to welcome the witnesses. From the Canadian Border Services Agency, we have Aaron McCrory, Vice President, Intelligence and Enforcement. With Canadian Security Intelligence Service, we have Vanessa Lloyd, Interim Director. From the Department of Citizenship and Immigration, we have Pemi Gill, Assistant Deputy Minister, and Aisha Zafar, Assistant Deputy Minister, Migration Integrity. And with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, we have Senator Gates Flaherty, Director General, Canadian Criminal Real-Time Identification Services. So we'll go straight away into questions.
I'm going to go back to what we were talking about when the minister was here. And while we appreciate the work and speed at which agencies acted when they had the information, I can understand why people would say that that's how the system works. What we haven't got to the bottom of here today is our concern about why you didn't have the information after this individual had been in this country for 6 years. And from the chronology that you provided this committee right before it started, had 6 different incidents of security checks. I'm going to ask you, whether it's Mr. McCrory or Ms. Lloyd, how can Canadians be sure that there are the proper checks in the system to make sure that this didn't happen before, that there aren't terrorists in our midst, and that this won't happen again? You can appreciate the Canadians want the answer to that question.
Mr. Chair, I can start, and then Vanessa, if you want to join in. Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. What I'd like to describe is, in fact, I think we have a very robust system in place when it comes to security screening. You've heard a little bit in the previous session. It starts with the assessment that is done by our colleagues in the IRCC, and then based on risk indicators, comprehensive files are referred to the cbsa and csis to do comprehensive security screening. And we can describe in more detail what is entailed in that, but I'd say from a cbsa point of view, it's about understanding the person who's in front of us, reviewing the information that we have, understanding their travel history, their work history, where they're coming from, and then doing in-depth analysis both in terms of open source research, but also running names and information aliases against a range of our intelligence and enforcement databases. If necessary, then we also dig into further getting information from domestic as well as international partners. And then we provide a recommendation to our IRCC in terms of, but sorry.
Yeah, that has all been covered. I just want you to appreciate that that this individual who is allegedly on an ISIS video from 2015 that was publicly available has been in this country for 6 years before the RCMP thwarted a terrorist plot that would have killed people in the GTA, somewhere in Toronto, presumably, after 6 security checks. You can appreciate why Canadians are concerned, can't you?
So again, our outcome, the goal that we're focused on is ensuring the protection of Canada and Canadians. And so when we make our decisions, when we do our analysis, it's based on the information that we have available at any given moment in time. I think
this is the most robust process that could have happened in this case. You're
think-
telling Canadians that?
I'm telling Canadians that we have a robust system in place, but as the minister indicated as well earlier, we are asking ourselves, do improvements need to be made? So we are conducting.
So there wasn't
review.
a failure in this?
I would go back to the point is that we've made the best decisions we can at those moments in time with the information that was available.
So Canadians watching this see that, again, 6 security checks, 6 years of this individual who is publicly on an ISIS videotape, who is now behind bars or being held on very serious terrorism charges. You think the system, you really believe that the system worked as it should? As the minister, he dismissed anything that was wrong with the system here today in his testimony. You really think that that's how the system should work here? You're really telling Canadians who are watching at home that the system is robust and everything worked as it should in this case?
What I'm telling Canadians is we're asking ourselves, can there be improvements made to the system? We're taking a very hard look at that. We're doing that in collaboration with our partners in csis, in the IRCC. We're going to do a representative sample of cases that have had positive assessments in the past and ask ourselves, have we missed anything? Are there any systemic issues, any gaps in our processes?
Anything. There's been 6 incidents of security checks here. Of course you've missed something. These guys were just arrested. A father-son duo were just arrested in a hotel room 10 minutes from the riding that I represent and within 40 minutes of the riding that committee members here represent. Of course you've missed something. Has there been any consequences for anybody who has been involved in any of these checks?
There's nothing to indicate at this moment in time that we had information available to us when we made those decisions that would...
That's a problem?
I'm saying we're asking ourselves if we need to review some of our processes and systems.
I appreciate that you're asking yourself these questions, but don't you think it's a problem that you didn't know that this guy was awarded a visa here 6 years ago after being in an ISIS video from 2015 that is publicly available and was arrested with his son days before committing a terrorist attack?
I'm apologizing, and I just have to repeat that, in fact, we made the best decisions that we could at that moment in time based on the information that we had. I think we have robust systems in place, but we are asking ourselves, can we do more? And we're looking backwards to see if, in fact, we need to do more.
I don't think there is a single Canadian watching today that would agree that you have robust systems in place if this is what happened. I don't think there's a single Canadian today watching saying, you know what, the system worked exactly as it should. What happened? Where were the failures? Why did this government fail?
I'm not sure there are any failures. Again, we are going to do a respective view and to see if there's more, if we missed anything, and if there is, we will make corrections. We have 183 staff at CBSA that every day are conducting security screening. About 206,000 per year we get coming our way, and we issued about I want to say 130 decisions last year. So.
Guy who slipped through the cracks. Can you assure Canadians that there hasn't been any more, that there aren't terrorists in our midst, that this won't happen in the future? I appreciate that you think that this is a robust system that worked exactly as it should, but I think people watching this would disagree with you.
What I would assure Canadians is that we have multiple lines of defense in place. So if we don't capture them at the stage of security screening, we also look at people coming to the country. And as you heard from earlier testimony, about 7,500 people were no-boarded prior to even departing for Canada. About, I want to say about 37,000 people were turned away from Canada upon entry. And then we have an additional line of defense in terms of our inland investigations. So last year we launched 88,000 inland investigations based on concerns about inadmissibility. When we find inadmissibility, we take those cases to the Immigration and Refugee Board, who's a decision maker. Last year we removed 15,000 people, of which about 700-800 were serious inadmissibilities. So there's multiple lines of defense that are in place. We don't rely on a single point of failure. We have multiple lines of defense, and we're asking ourselves, do improvements need to be made? And that's, I think, a powerful message for Canadians is we do want to know if improvements can be made, and if there can be, we will make improvements.
Thank you, Ms. Lantzman. We go now to Mr. Gaillard.
So I wanted to touch on the line of questioning that Ms. Lantzman was asking. We in Canada obviously have tens and hundreds of thousands of people that seek to get a visitor visa to come to Canada, and there's security screening processes to make sure that the wrong individuals don't get access to Canada. Obviously, in this case, someone did arrive in Canada and then filed an asylum claim. Is it theoretically even possible to search every single video or to conduct a global facial recognition search on every video for the individuals that are applying for visitor visas to Canada? And do we even have the resources to scour the dark web for every single individual that applies for a visitor visa to Canada? Is that even possible, theoretically?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I can start off by talking about how we initially screen temporary resident applicants, so those coming in to visit Canada. Every application for an individual who wants to come to Canada as a visitor is screened by the IRCC with that initial security screening. And so we look at biometrics. Biometrics helps us not only to identify whether or not there's any criminality that is known, but it also helps us to, in terms of identity management. This is the first time that we're seeing an individual, and we anchor that identity for the individual throughout the entire process. Our officers are highly trained in different risk indicators. These risk indicators are created collaboratively with our partners at the CBSA and at CSIS. Those risk indicators are clues for the officers when they're going through an application on where there might be some type of elevated risk or where there might be an opening
so
to...
Just to interrupt, once we've reached that elevated level of risk, for that pool of people, is it possible then to conduct a dark web search or a facial recognition search for all the content on the internet in the world for those individuals? I don't think that's theoretically even possible, no?
My colleagues at CBSA or CSIS who would then at that point conduct a comprehensive security screening if we referred the application. Vanessa, did you want to?
Certainly. Perhaps I can jump in, Mr. Chair. So I'll refer to the members of the committee to the information put before them in terms of the range of other tools that are available in each and every case. And so upon referral where we do have indications of a possible national security concern, a risk indicator, doesn't mean that there is information present at that time. We can apply a range of tools. And you'll see in the material that we put to the committee that can include, as we discussed this morning, checks with international partners, reviews of open sources and other tools. I will refrain from getting into the specifics of our capabilities as it relates to the members' specific question in terms of technical capabilities and methodologies. But what I can say in answer to part of the concern I'm hearing from the committee is that while I said this morning there is an increasing and intensifying risk as it relates to violent extremism, the members should be assured, and Canadians should be assured, that there is a very small number of people who are present in Canada who are willing to mobilize to violence.
So I still want to focus on the question regarding scouring the dark web. Should our law enforcement be scouring the dark web when it comes to conducting routine security screens, assessments?
I would say from a CBSA point of view, and Ted Gallivan alluded to this earlier, we are asking ourselves, do we need to do more in that particular space? So as part of the review, we're asking ourselves, what's the feasibility of that? What would it take from a technology point of view? And what would be the usability of the information that we'd get from that and the feasibility of us finding it? It is a daunting challenge, but we are asking ourselves that question.
It's concerning the case of Mr. Mohammed Hoblos, who was scheduled to come to British Columbia to speak at Thompson Rivers University earlier this month. He has been registered in the European Union on the Schengen information system. So he's been barred from entering Germany, Norway, and the Netherlands. And I believe he was also detained and deported from Switzerland. So I just want to use his as an example because there may be others. And I wanted to point out those countries because, of course, Germany, Norway, Netherlands, and Switzerland are strong Western democracies. They share the same values as Canada does, and I'm sure have very similar outlooks as the Canadian government. So I guess in comparison with other countries which are very much aligned with Canada's approach on the world stage and share our values, what can we learn from other countries which may have decided to bar certain individuals? And are there instances where those individuals, other instances where those individuals have been admitted to Canada? I'd just like to hear from some of the people who are with us today, your views on how Canada judges that information and why at times we may find ourselves at odds with some of our closest allies and partners who share our strong democratic values.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. In terms of when an individual is inadmissible to Canada, it's based on the legislation. So the Immigration Refugee Protection Act clearly outlines the reasons why an individual would be inadmissible. Using the example that you provided, you mentioned something similar to hate speech, Mr. Chair. So under the security inadmissibility in IRPA, there are various reasons why an individual could be inadmissible. Those include things like engaging in terrorism, being a danger to the security of Canada. Our officers must be able to meet the threshold of a reasonable grounds to believe that an individual is inadmissible based on the requirements of the legislation. When it comes to what information other countries have available to them, that is relevant to their own inadmissibility requirements in those countries, which may be different than our legislation. However, we do have opportunity to review that if an individual has been convicted outside of Canada of an offence that if in Canada would constitute an indictable offence under an Act of Parliament, or two offences not arising out of a single occurrence, then that person would be deemed inadmissible. So our officers would then work with our national security and law enforcement partners, as well as our counsel, to ensure that we could meet the reasonable grounds to believe that that is an equivalent offence in Canada, and therefore deem them inadmissible.
We'll start our second round of questions with Mr. Motz. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for being here. You know, one of the things that I've sat for the first hour or first 2 hours this morning and I listened carefully, and I'm still concerned as Canadians are, is, you know, how did this happen? And the confidence they need to ensure that it doesn't keep happening. We haven't had that yet today. And I appreciate the fact that our national security apparatus acted responsibly and efficiently to thwart the attack, and that's kudos to them. However, there was a failure that occurred. We need to ensure that that failure doesn't keep happening. Now, Mr. McCormick, cbsa has a critical role and responsibility in the process to protect Canadian citizens from those coming into Canada with dangerous or divisive ideologies, and who pose a threat to our national security and public safety, and to not allow them entry. And you have, you know, you've talked about multiple ways that you do that. Now, what's interesting that I found is I go through the timeline that we were given just before the meeting today about the various times that the accused in this matter, senior, was refused as a non-genuine, visitor. He then received a temporary resident visa. He was refused again, or not refused. He was given it. He was then assessed and found that a risk indicator, and that happened over and over and over again. These risk indicators. That's when cbsa is supposed to step in and take over. Now, what checks did you actually conduct to make that happen? Do you have access to the database that Mr. My NDP colleague talks about, the Shagan database? Did you run this individual through the FBI database? What actually are you through the Homeland Security database? Did you run them through anything that would give rise? Obviously, someone who is in an office who's interviewing this individual had concerns. They identified a risk. That same risk appeared again months later. It again appeared again years later. Yet this person was able to get temporary status, permanent status, and then become a Canadian citizen, all while these risks were being presented. How can we sit here today and ensure the Canadian public that we know that there's a problem, but we don't know, obviously this timeline even identifies the problem, and yet he was still able to be here. And I'm actually quite concerned about what that actually means. You also indicated that you mentioned before in testimony previously that cbsa has a role to play in removing people ordered removed from this country. Of those people that were ordered removed, how many actually remain at large? Do you know the answer to that?
Well, I think of the ones that were removed, they were removed. There's about
there's thousands that are ordered removed. Some of them are ordered removed based on their risk to Canada.
I apologize. I don't have, through you, Mr. Chair, I apologize. I don't have our kind of removal stats immediately at hand, but I think you're absolutely right in the sense that last year we actually did remove 15,000 people, but there are, for example, about, in public reported data, it's about 30,000 people who are we're trying to track down, for example.
Right. And many of those you can't find, right?
Correct.
So it's reasonable to presume, based on how this individual gained access to this country and received citizenship, that some of those also have got into this country, illegitimately. Now, one of the concerns that I wonder about is, as you navigate, and Miss the lady from Miss Safar from immigration as well. You guys have a joint role to play, and really, you guys do the interviews, and you guys are the first matter of defense before it gets into CSIS if there's an issue. What do you do, and how do you check to make sure that obviously people lie to you all the time? And I'm sure is that what happened here? And what steps are being taken by both CBSA and immigration and refugees to make sure that you can see through the lies that obviously this person told? Because people come to Canada for legitimate reasons and for illegitimate reasons, for nefarious reasons. So what are you doing to ensure that those who lie to you are caught and not allowed in?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I would like to start by saying the vast majority of those individuals who visit Canada, of which we had over 7 million applications we processed last year, the vast majority of them are truthful, genuine visitors to Canada. We at the IRCC are responsible to determine not only admissibility, but also eligibility. So I would like to clarify the two, Mr. Chair. The eligibility is really around, are you eligible under the conditions set out in the Act? So are you coming to be what you say you're coming to be? If you're applying as a visitor, do you intend to stay temporarily?
So with that in mind...
Mr. Motz, you're done. I'm just giving her time to answer your question.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead. Oh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the eligibility would include whether or not you are a genuine visitor. So that's separate from the admissibility when we would start to screen where we do the security screening and then perhaps refer to our partners for a comprehensive security screening. Our applications set out a number of different questions where we do rely on the information that's provided by the applicants. However, the applications ask for a number of different details for the individuals to provide, and those details are then assessed against the risk indicator packages, which again are clues to the officer where we might need to do a little bit more of a comprehensive digging. We also submit biometrics, not only to the RCMP, but we have information sharing agreements with our Five Eyes partners. So we are able to check with them if there is any known derogatory information on the individual who is applying to enter Canada. The risk indicators as well, I would like to point that the risk indicators are based on the serious inadmissibilities in the legislation. So it's not only on security grounds, which would include espionage, terrorism, danger to Canada. It could be for human rights or international human rights or international rights violations. It could be for serious organized crime as well. So all of those different indicators are part of our risk indicator packages. And my colleague at the CBSA...
Thank you. I'm going to have to cut you off there.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Very quickly.
It's those risk indicators that are developed by CBSA and CSIS and that we provide training to IRCC officers on that tell it this is a file that you should look at. It's not a definitive statement there is a risk. It is a question. It prompts the question that leads to the comprehensive security screening that we do in partnership, not instead of but we do in partnership with organizations like CSIS.
In regards to the citizenship, can you explain to this committee more about the process of revocation and the thresholds that must be met in case if you have to revoke citizenship for anyone?
Thank you for the question. There is, under the Citizenship Act of Canada, provisions that allow for the revocation of someone who has been granted citizenship. And under that, the Minister of IRCC may seek a declaration from the federal court that the person obtained citizenship by false representation or fraud or knowingly concealing material circumstances. So the process for that is such that IRCC does an initial assessment as to whether or not there is sufficient evidence and information to proceed with starting the revocation process. The client is notified, the individual is notified that there is some information and we're assessing. They're given 30 days from a procedural fairness perspective to provide any additional information they'd like to do so, at which time the IRCC, on behalf of the minister, advises the client that we are pursuing and moving forward with a revocation procedure. Depending on the circumstances under which of those three areas, or the combination, the false representation or fraud or knowingly concealing material circumstances, we would then proceed with a submission to the federal court, who would be the decision maker in terms of the revocation, although the client always has the choice to request that the Minister of IRCC be the decision maker.
I'm going to go back to my previous line of questioning about the honesty or lack thereof of the senior suspect in this particular conversation. Do you believe it's likely in this case that he misrepresented himself on the files, and do you believe he lied? And I'll ask both Mr. Cormier and Mr. Zafar.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Due to the ongoing criminal proceedings, I cannot provide any further details on.
Well, that's not a question about the ongoing investigation. This is a question about his immigration status and how he got here. So obviously he came in under false pretense. I mean, if what you're telling Canadians is that the systems that you have in place work, and they work fine, then you would have been able to identify, some affiliation somewhere. And because you didn't, that would, give me rise to believe that either, the checks weren't done appropriately or properly, or somebody misrepresented themselves, and which is not new to either one of you and your departments. And I'm just wondering whether, if that's the case. And Mr. Cormier, or Mick Cormier, I would ask you that same question.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair, and I'm under the same restrictions in terms of what I can comment about in these particular cases.
Well, we can draw conclusions based on both of your, what you can and can't say, and I appreciate that. Ms. Zafar, you had mentioned something, and I think, Mr. McCurry, you did the same thing about you follow the requirements of the legislation. For admissibility, admittance, etc. Do you not think that Canadians have a right to believe and a right to expect that we must always err on the side of caution, that we must always be on the side of national security and public safety when we allow individuals in that we may not have all the answers to?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Our officers make every effort to satisfy themselves that an individual is not inadmissible to Canada. Working with our partners, they will do a thorough review based on the information that is available to them and to our partners at the time to make that determination. My colleague might have something that he wants to add from the CBSA.
I would, again, just echo the point in which that our staff undertake these thorough reviews. The criticism that we get as an agency is not that we're not doing thorough reviews. Typically, the criticism is we're taking too long because we take the time necessary to do the most thorough review that we can based on the best available information at any moment in time. And it's based on that information that we provide a recommendation to our colleagues in IRCC.
So as you look at the current structure we have in place now to ensure that individuals do not enter the country in the manner in which this individual did, is there legislative things that we need to look at that need to be fixed? Is there something, some ideology, some position of this current government on lax immigration standards that impact this, in your opinions? Mr. McCorry?
What I would say, and again, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. What I would say again is that is one of the reasons we are doing this review, to understand what happened in this particular case. Are there systemic issues? What solutions are required? They may be procedural fixes on our part. They may be allocation of resources. It may be, as I've suggested for CBSA, we need to do more on the dark web. And it may be legislative or regulatory changes. It's premature for me to speculate as to what they are, but that's certainly on our agenda in terms of what we need to look at.
So, Ms. Lanceman asked you a question earlier about, and I believe you answered affirmatively. I'm sure everybody, as witnesses today, understand what Canadians expect. Like, you want them, you understand their concern. I take it. Is that a yes?
Yes.
So then it's obvious then that they need answers, and not just and not just for this committee's sake, but for the sake of our national security and public safety moving forward. Because if one individual got in this way, I'll guarantee you that there are others here already, and we already know that based on 700 IRGC individuals who are already in this country. How they got here, it begs another question. How did we let those people in who already have affiliations to an organization that's a terrorist organization? So when you do this deep dive as to where the gaps were, I think you need to go beyond this case and look at all cases for both immigration and the CBSA on how we can fix this broken system, because it is broken.
In fact, and what we want to do, to your point, we want to make sure that we do the level of analysis and the level of thinking about this that Canadians expect of us. So I don't want to give you an off-the-cuff answer in terms of what we need to do, and looking at the system as a whole. And it's not just looking at these two cases. As the Minister and Mr. Gallivan indicated, we'll be looking at a representative sample of all the cases that we've processed over a period of time to understand if there's any gaps there, and again, what improvements, if any, we need to make.
Thank you, Mr. Motz. We go now to Mr. Muff.
I have a question with regard to the dark web. Several times today, the Conservative Party has talked about videos being readily available, publicly available. And I recognize you can't talk about information in this case. But there was research that was done that says key characteristics, and I'm quoting, key characteristics of the dark web include the inability to search or list them through legal platforms, passwords to gain entry when accessible, and hidden identities of users, network traffic, IP addresses, and data exchange through them. While the dark web was originally built for military communication and advocating freedom of speech, it has also provided technology enablement and power to adversaries to masquerade heinous activities. So I'm not being flippant here at all, but perhaps, Ms. Lloyd, this could be directed to you. How do you access the dark web?
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. Remember, I'm not able to answer that question without revealing the details of our operational tradecraft methodologies and capabilities.
Okay. As an individual, is it easy for me to Google darkweb.com and be able to access information that's on there? And I'm not trying to be flippant, but it has been portrayed here today that it's easy to access. You can't tell us how to access it because it's in the national security interest not to share that information. So is it easy for me to access the dark web?
Mr. Chair, Honourable Member, I think what I can say is that we've spoken a bit this morning about the complexities of living in a digital age, and that would be reflected in some of the conversation we've had today about the challenges of being able to access information at the time that information is perhaps needed with regards to decisions that have to be made or files that need to be reviewed.
Mr. Brock, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to start with refuting what I believe to be a false narrative at this committee. And I've listened very carefully to my Liberal colleagues. I've listened to some of the commentary from these witnesses. And I guess to a Canadian observer who is not entirely familiar with the circumstances that surrounded the creation of this particular meeting, one would think that all is well in Canada, that everything is working as it's intended to work. the CSIS is working appropriately, that the CBSA is working appropriately, law enforcement's working appropriately, and the government is doing its job. Well, that can't be furthest from the truth. The number one responsibility of Justin Trudeau and his government, number one responsibility of the CBSA and CSIS, is to keep Canadians safe. Not some of the time, all of the time. And what has happened here is we were within a hair's breadth, minutes, hours, potentially days away of a mass casualty on the Toronto Jewish community. So clearly this wasn't hatched overnight by the two accused. They were probably planning for days, weeks, months, all under the radar of CSIS, all under the radar of immigration, all under the radar of CBSA, all under the radar of our law enforcement. So I've got one phrase to say to this committee, to this committee and to Canadians. Thank God for France. Thank God for French intelligence that gave CSIS the tip. This wasn't a national in France who was planning something against Canadians. This was an individual that we granted Canadian citizenship to that completely fell under the radar map until a tip went to CSIS. And then CSIS got the RCMP involved, and we stopped what could have been a significant mass casualty event. And I'm sorry to all the witnesses, you failed in your responsibilities to keep us safe. You didn't do your job. There, but the grace of God and good French intelligence, they are behind bars where they should be. Now, I listened very carefully to Mr. McCrory's words. We have a thorough system. Our reviews of citizens or of individuals coming into our country, it takes time. You talked about what Canadians expect. Well, sir, I can tell you that I've got reports from news media that strongly suggests that the two accused in custody is by no means a one-off. In fact, I'm going to read from this report. This is from the National Post from a few weeks ago. American authorities recently announced the apprehension of 233 terrorist suspects seeking entry from Canada into the United States. Were you aware of that, CSIS?
I'm sorry, I apologize. I'm not familiar with the direct reference that you
Sure.
may be alleging to in the media.
How about Mr. McCrory? Was CBSA aware of this?
Again, like my colleague, I'm not aware of the direct
Wow.
reference that you're speaking.
233 would-be terrorists walking the streets of Canada, all under the radar map of this Prime Minister, this government, and our professional public service and our security agency that wanted to get in the United States and wreak havoc in that country, and they were walking freely. We do, and I support my friend and colleague Mr. Motz's assessment, we have a broken system, and I hope to dear God, for the sake of the safety of Canadians, you identify very quickly and robustly where the breakdown happened and fire the individuals who didn't do their job. Now, Ms. Danmoff talks about how difficult it is to access the dark web. Well, you know what? Canadians aren't expecting Ms. Danmoff to protect us. We're expecting CSIS, law enforcement, and the government who has access to the dark web. And this should have been on your radar map, and you failed us. There again, but the grace of God and good intelligence from France. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Brock. Did anyone wish to respond? Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, I would like to repeat my earlier testimony that I would refute the premise that this was a failure, in that the good work of CSIS and our law enforcement partners between the time when CSIS received the information in June of 2024 and the time of the arrests on July 28th, and the fact that these individuals are in custody is a testimony to the good work and professionalism of those officers in all of our agencies. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Surprised that Mr. Brock is so fond of France, considering the fact that he recently went there and got immediately called back to Canada by his boss after he took 2 plane tickets, I think, to finally make it there. But nonetheless, I do want to assure that the witnesses today know that not everybody around this table, or indeed Canadians, feel the same way that Mr. Brock does. What you just saw there was his stunt for social media, which he will use later, and most likely to raise money for the Conservative Party of Canada, and it was nothing more than that. My question to you is this. All of the focus today seems to have been on the fact that individuals entered into Canada that had a plan all along. But it is, whether or not that's true or not, we will let the courts determine that and appropriately deal with it. But my question is this. Is it not true that a lot of people who become radicalized, it happens to after they're already here? So you don't have to be somebody who is radicalized, enter to Canada. You can actually already be in Canada or a Canadian citizen to become radicalized. Is that true?
Mr. Chair, thank you. As I believe we mentioned earlier this morning, that the work of security services and National Security Agency is continuous. And as I mentioned earlier, again, that is with regards to threats that come from without Canada and from within.
What we saw here, what's been widely reported and what's culminated in criminal charges, we're obviously very happy that our security and law enforcement personnel foiled what would have been a catastrophic act. We're very thankful for that. At the same time, I echo what my colleague, Monsieur Fortin, said, where, I wrote down here that we've gotten the answers, but the answers don't feel all that reassuring. So I'm trying to look at this. I'm trying to take off my hat as a lawyer or even as a parliamentarian. So I try to look through the lens of my father, for instance. And so I'm looking at this through the lens of the ordinary Canadian. And, for instance, with you, Mr. McQuarrie, when you started out, you said, I'm not sure that there are any failures. And you talked about the robust process. With all due respect, I'm not sure that satisfies the average Canadian. I'm not sure that satisfies my father. So I'm going to go through each of you. Ms. Lloyd, can you see how, given what we know, this is what we know. This person came in to Canada in 2017. They were granted a permanent residency and granted citizenship in 2024, despite there being evidence online of active acts with ISIS. Can you see how the average Canadian is not comforted by this notion of reassurance?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think, Honourable Member, the way I will respond to your question is that I think Canadians, in fact, should be very reassured by the comments that both myself and my colleagues have made here today, in that we take our security screening responsibilities very seriously. We have intelligence professionals and officers at each of our 3 agencies that do their work on a daily basis with rigor and professionalism. They made the best decisions available to them on the information that was available to them at that time as it relates to the security screening responsibilities they had on this and any file. And most importantly,
arrest. I'm not trying to cut you off. We do have limited time. But again, I'm not asking whether Canadians should be reassured. And I'll ask Ms. Gildas. I'm not asking whether Canadians should be reassured based on what you've said. What I'm saying is, can you understand how Canadians have serious questions here, and that perhaps this is not a situation, and Canadians shouldn't necessarily, and are justified in seeing this as a situation where there were no failures? Can you see how the average Canadian would see that, Ms. Gill?
I'll defer this question to my colleague, Madame Zafar. Thank you.
Okay, Madame.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. We came to the committee today and disclosed documents, which we did so with the effort and intention of being able to meet the committee's objectives of understanding the immigration security screening process and also maintaining the confidence of Canadians in the immigration security screening the immigration systems. I understand that there are still outstanding questions. However, due to the ongoing criminal proceedings and other protections that we have outlined in the chronology, we aren't able to go into further details.
And I'm not asking about that. I'm saying somebody came here in 2017. They were this close to committing a terrorist act. And will nobody on the panel acknowledge that Canadians are justified in being afraid that Canadians can still have questions, that perhaps this isn't a situation of there were no failures? Is there anybody that will acknowledge that on the panel?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. The system that we have in place is an ecosystem. As the statements that were made earlier, there is no one single point in which we rely on for the safety and security of Canada. So it starts with the initial touch point that we as IRCC have with an applicant. We have the before Canada piece. We've talked about CBSA and their ability to then use any additional information before an individual boards an aircraft. The point of entry, if there's additional information that has been received where CBSA would be able to identify those threats. And then we have the domestic network as well.
I understand the processes, and you've been through that very clearly. And that's not what I'm asking about. And for the last 4 minutes, I've been asking about how the average Canadian should see this and the lens through which they should be looking at, and whether the average Canadian, whether you can see. And with all due respect, you're here in the security apparatus. Just one moment, please. You're here. And the average Canadian is on the ground.
Thank you.
And I'm not sure that they should be satisfied.
Thank you, Mr. Caputo.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. I don't have any further questions for the witnesses, so I'm okay. Thank you very much.
Thank
I can take that 2 minutes and a half, Mr. Chair.
I think in fairness, we'll call this a day.